Hello, I'm Keith with the Trombone Shop at Schmidt Music, back with another instrument review for you. And today it's really not so much a review as a comparison. One of the big questions I still get asked about in the trombone world is open wrap versus closed wrap F attachment. Right? What are the differences between these? Why was the closed wrap so popular before? Why is the open wrap more popular now? Really, what are the differences or similarities between them? And frankly, it's not so often that we actually have a chance to compare similar or the same models with open wrap versus closed wrap F attachments. But we happen to have a closed wrap Bach 42B and, of course, a open wrap Bach 42BO both in the shop at the same time. So I said this is the perfect opportunity to really be able to sit down and compare the two different wraps. Do they really make a difference in how the instrument sounds, what the response is on the F attachment? Are there other factors that go into it? So I'm really excited to share this comparison with you. I'll be playing both of them, talking about the experience afterwards, and I'll be playing everything today on my trusty Bach 5G mouthpiece. the conversation of closed wrap versus open wrap F attachments, the benefits or the drawbacks of each of them and how they really compare. This has been going on for literally decades upon decades. A little bit of background in case you're not familiar with what these terms mean. So we have our F attachment on the tenor, right? This is the idea that when we push down the valve, it reroutes the air through this additional tubing, thus lowering the key of the instrument, changing it from B flat down to F. What this does functionally for us is gives us alternate positions, right? It takes the place of sixth position. In other words, we can play anything we played in sixth position, we can play in first position. Anything we played in second position, we can play in second position instead of seventh. And it also extends the lower register of the instrument. All of these things have become increasingly important to us in our classical settings, whether it is wind ensemble, concert band, our symphonic settings, brass quintets, solo repertoire, all of this, which is why our larger instruments for those settings with the F attachment have become staple, right? This combination. But when we have this tubing for the F attachment, there are different ways to wrap that tubing. I've talked about some videos where we have, different makers have unique, wrap styles, but all of these different ways to wrap this tubing really fit into two categories, either closed wrap or open wrap. With the closed wrap instruments like this, all of the tubing for the F attachment stays within the larger profile of the bell section, right? And what that means is we have some tight curves put into the mix here, right? There's multiple different loops that essentially has to pass through. Now, the other variant of that, and this is really something that we saw becoming more common in especially let's say the late 1970s going into 1980s. It's become really in a lot of ways, for reasons we can talk about, has become, at least in the US, has become the dominant style of wrap is what we call the open wrap. And this is just the idea that the tubing for the F attachment just goes through one long loop instead of having multiple different curvatures involved within it. And like I mentioned, there are different ways to handle this, but the short part of this is that these two different wrap styles, they move the air through the wrap differently. I've talked about this a little bit before. In the brass world, I feel that anything that we affect as musicians, anything our manufacturers affect in how they build the instrument, how it affects the playability of the sound, either comes down to resonance, how the instrument vibrates, or airflow, how the air moves through the instrument. And that can be how the air moves through the whole instrument, or how does the air move through, for example, just the F attachment when we reroute the air through that additional tubing. So, what have been the perceived benefits, drawbacks of these two? So the benefit with the closed wrap, as it's been mentioned, is that it's just a smaller profile, right? We have everything smaller. You don't have all of this additional tubing sticking out up at the top there. And with this, by having all this extra curvature, there are some folks that feel like it aids a little bit in the response of the lower register. So for example, that extra resistance feels like for some folks, they can lean into that lower register, helps give them a little bit more immediacy when they're playing below the staff. Now, for those folks that this style does not work for, the opposite is true. For folks who prefer open wrap instruments, they find that switching over to the valve on the closed wrap immediately changes the airflow. It's a little bit like stepping on the brakes, right? And so it's a very different feel from the open instrument. In other words, the instrument without the F attachment, right? And so that we have that break. And for a lot of folks, they feel like it changes the response. It makes it harder for them to play, that extra resistance, right? And they feel that with all of these extra curves in there, there's a kind of a general philosophy in brass building that the more curves, especially the more tight curves we put into any one length of tubing, it's going to slowly strip away overtones, frequencies within the sound. In other words, with this, the theory is that the F attachment, when we're using the valve, is going to sound different than when we're not, versus the open wrap, where it's going to sound more similar. Now, these are all the theories. What did I find in practice? Well, frankly, to an extent, I think a lot of these attributes are true. So what I found, and I'm somebody who I play on both closed wrap and open wrapped instruments, what I have found with this is that the open wrap was just significantly more comfortable. like we said, the blow going in and out of the F attachment was just much more similar. I didn't have to be changing my airflow as much with all of it. And I felt like I was able to actually keep my sound more open because of that as well. I didn't have to be changing things with my airflow to all of a sudden accommodate these little downshifts in the airflow coming in and out of the valve, right? And so whether I was doing things like the Sansons or the Rochu, or especially those two, I think those shifts in and out of there where I'm trying to be very, very legato connected. With this, I had to approach it differently, not necessarily in a bad way. It was different. And there were certain times there where I felt like the shifts in and out of the F attachment, I was able to lean into that, a little bit of that extra resistance, use a little bit of that resistance to at times help maybe secure my response, my slur coming in and out of it. But it was different, and I certainly did notice, and hopefully this comes through in the recording, I felt like there was a difference in the sound coming in and out of the valve. It wasn't like overly pronounced, and certainly I have played on open versus closed wrap designs where with the closed wrap, it's such a different timbre with this. With this, I think it was a little bit more muted, the difference was, but I think the difference was still there. When I went onto the F attachment on the 42B, immediately had a little bit more focus, a little bit more kind of insistency a little bit. I feel like it lost a little bit of this open broadness, whereas with the open wrap, again, I felt like it maintained all of that as well. Now, the other interesting thing, and this is actually something I hadn't thought about a lot until recently, but it was the idea of how does the positioning of the wrap and the weight of this and how we're bracing everything together, how does that change how the instrument resonates? And is that going to affect the overall playability of the instrument? In a lot of my videos, I've talked about all of these different ways that we can affect the resonance, the vibration of the instrument, and the smallest changes can make a big difference. And here's the really interesting thing. I felt like there was a performance difference overall between the two of these. Am I able to attribute everything with that to the closed wrap versus open wrap? I'm not sure, but with this, I did feel like it had a little bit more weight to the response. In other words, I felt like I had to put a little bit more energy through it to get everything to vibrate, to start resonating. And I felt like in certain areas, for example, as I was getting down below the staff, getting into the pedal register, I really felt like I had to be working for that a little bit differently. And again, these are areas where I'm not using the valve at all. This is just the overall response of the instrument. Versus with the open wrap, everything felt more natural. Now, maybe it helps that my standard go-to instrument is an open wrap Bach 42 DO. This isn't my horn. This is like just a brand new one, but it still felt more similar. And again, it felt like it was more open and resonant. I could blow through more. It gave me more of the immediacy I was expecting. And again, it's hard to say for sure. I'd be interested to know if others have had this experience, but in a way, it kind of makes sense to me. We're keeping a lot more mass with the closed wrap F attachment, more focused here. We have more points where the F attachment is braced together, it's braced to the bell, all of which is going to resist vibration a little bit. Whereas in comparison, with the open wrap, we're changing where we're evening out the overall mass of the F attachment, and we don't have nearly the same attachment points. So in theory, that tubing is going to be resonating a little bit freer. It's going to, in theory, allow, for example, the bell to resonate and vibrate a little bit freer as well. So is there a direct correlation between that? Hard to say. I need to do more work with it. I am inclined to say that there may be something to that as well. So with all of that said, is there really a plus versus a minus? Not really. To a large extent, it really is going to be player preference. Again, I will say from kind of the American standpoint, really the open wrap has become the staple, right? And I think for a lot of the reasons we talked about, in particular, the evenness of the blow overall, just the feeling that you don't have to be changing things as much. But there are places for the closed wrap design. We see, for example, in a number of different intermediate level designs, designed to help a young student get started with an F attachment. They maybe don't have the years of experience to fill up an instrument quite the same way. There are times where having a little bit of added resistance of the closed wrap can aid with the response in that lower register as well. Or again, depending on the player's own approach, there can be a lot of benefits or drawbacks. It's all dependent on the individual at the end of the day. But I was really glad to be able to actually spend some time and really dig in and think about what these differences might be for me, and perhaps share what those differences might be for you. So if you enjoyed the video, if you have any thoughts, maybe you have a 42B with a closed wrap, maybe you have a BO with an open wrap, another design, maybe you've been able to compare those. We'd love to have your feedback in the comments. If you like the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to our channel, becoming a part of our community, and of course, you can find the Trombone Shop on Facebook and Instagram. As always, thanks for watching.